A new tuberculosis vaccine trial has been introduced. About 20,000 people are anticipated to take part in this trial across 60 sites in South Africa, Zambia, Malawi, Mozambique, Kenya, Indonesia, as well as Vietnam. The vaccine gained popularity after it provided 54% protection against active pulmonary tuberculosis disease without evident safety concerns. The World Health Organization predicts that the Phase 2B trial could potentially save 8.5 million lives and prevent 76 million people from falling ill. Let's now explore the vaccine further with the Director of Maternal and Child Health at the Reproductive Health and HIV Institute at the University of Witwatersrand, Dr. Fairlie, joining us this morning. Dr. Fairlie, good morning. Thank you so much for making time for us. Tell us about the M72 and what makes it so different from the other trials around tuberculosis vaccines.
And thanks very much for the opportunity to be on the show. So this particular vaccine is the vaccine that's furthest along in the sort of development pathway. So there are a number of other TB vaccines that are being studied currently, but this one has just really got the most data behind it and the most evidence to really be able to move into what we'd call a Phase 3 study. And as you highlight, expecting to enroll around 20,000 people globally on this particular study.
Yeah. What was it that was found with Phase 2 that gave the researchers the go-ahead to say that maybe let's now go into Phase 3? And I also note as well that looking at the number of participants in this trial, that initially the idea was to have around 26,000 people participate, but that number has now been reduced to 20,000.
Right. So the study was changed slightly in what we call an amendment, which is a fairly sort of frequent thing that we see with these clinical trials. The main reason for that was really to try and get us to a successful product earlier. So really to try and cut out any additional time that wasn't seemed to be necessary in terms of actually moving the study forward. So certainly none of the reductions in numbers will compromise safety or will compromise any of the data that we expect to see in the study. It will really just get us to that point quicker. So in the first trial, what they saw is, as you pointed out, that in people who had previously been infected with TB, so had what we call latent TB, which is something that we can test on a blood test. So just to really distinguish that from having active TB or TB disease, where somebody actually has the symptoms of TB, so, cough, night sweats, coughing up blood. In people who had latent TB, there was a 50% reduction in the cases of pulmonary TB. So, and that's really one of the most promising results that we're seeing at the moment, and that was really why there was the decision to take the study forward. In the interim, there was also a study done using the same vaccine in people living with HIV, and that study was done in South Africa, also showing a good safety and good immunogenicity profile for the M72 vaccine.
Yeah, and looking at the number of, looking at the demographic of the people that will be participating in the trial in the age 14 to 44 years, why specifically that age, considering that the WHO has also raised concerns around pediatric tuberculosis?
So that is the age group that we see the most infectious TB. So that's where people get TB that can easily be sort of passed on or transmitted to others. And so that's really why that age group is key. And sorry, just to correct you, it's from 15 to 44. But that is where the most burden of transmission to others actually occurs. As you point out, pediatric TB is still a critical issue, and there are a number of studies going on that are actually looking at vaccines that can be administered to children. The way that these vaccines usually work, or actually any studies usually work, is that the studies first get conducted on adult populations and older adolescents, and then steadily, if the vaccine is successful and safe, then we would move down to younger age groups, because obviously children are much smaller. We need to know a bit more about their dosing and safety in that context.
Yeah.
So that's why we're focusing on that age group right now.
Okay. Funding, another problem, because phase 3 of this trial was delayed because of the issue around funding. The study being sponsored by the Bill and Melinda Gates Medical Research Institute. What should be done in terms of trying to make sure that there is enough funding, one, so that when you have trials like these, you have the results as soon as possible? And are you able to explain to us what led to the delay in funding for the third phase of this trial?
So some of the delays were a bit more sort of complex and related to the adjuvants, so the additional components that go into the vaccine. And as I mentioned, there was work sort of going on in the background. But, obviously, as you point out, the sooner that we can sort of get these trials going and get results, the better. Perhaps just to highlight that Gates MRI, as you point out, is the sponsor, and both Gates and Wellcome Trust are funding the study. And obviously it's critical for ongoing funding for us to actually be able to get to these points where we have products that are essentially, if this study runs well and we have the results that we're hoping for, this really could be a game changer in terms of prevention of TB in South Africa and other similar environments where we really have a very high burden of TB disease.
Yeah. In conclusion, the NHI, of course, a big debate and discussion around that. The president has said that he's just looking for his pen, and he will sign the bill into law. Is there any provision, though, in the NHI legislation that says that let's also put funding aside for research of this nature, considering the burden of disease when it comes to TB, specifically in South Africa?
I'm afraid I'm unqualified to answer that question. I'm sorry, I can't comment on that at this stage.
You can't comment on that. But just in conclusion, though, speaking about funding in general and how to raise funding for these researchers and considering how critical it is.
So, what we need is a global approach, really. Obviously we also would, there needs to be local funding contributed to these kind of studies, but there is also a global commitment to, hopefully coming close to eradicating TB. And I think that, when we see how much funding was sort of mobilized for COVID vaccines, hopefully the same, will follow for diseases such as TB, which really do remain to an extent neglected because they do tend to sort of fall in places that are probably less resourced, with higher burden.
Yeah, no, certainly. Thank you so much for your time. That was the Director of Maternal and Child Health at the Wits Reproductive Health and HIV Institute at Wits University, Dr. Fairlie. Thank you so much for making time for us this morning.